let's apply the reasonable standard. If we see a fine-tuned universe, what's more likely? Someone fine-tuned it, or it fine-tuned itself? Could the universe have created itself out of nothing? Is there some alternative explanation for the data at hand? No.
The time when I debate, it's people saying, nothing can come from nothing, you can't get something from nothing, so since there is something, someone must have wanted there to be something. Not, I think, a very impressive syllogism. I can't do it all this evening, but it's very easy for anyone to go and see Professor Lawrence Krauss deliver his brilliant lecture online called The Whole Universe from Nothing, which explains to you how indeed you can get very large numbers of things from nothing with the proper understanding. So admitting that I don't know exactly how it began is not at all the same as Dinesh's admission that he doesn't know either, because he feels he has to know. Because if it's not a matter of faith and it's not a matter of God, he can't say he believes in it a little bit. It must be a real belief to be genuine, and it must have some explanatory value. And he doesn't hold it very strongly, and it doesn't explain anything for which we have better explanations.
The standards that I'm appealing to are, in a way, very intuitive. We have currently a major scientific project to look for life on other planets. Now, truth of it is, if we were to get information that on, let's say, the moon Europa, we found hieroglyphics, some interesting architectural structures, some apparent roving vehicles, this would settle the argument. Right away, we would conclude, as long as we didn't put them there, that there must be some other forms of life that have done that. If someone came along and said molecules of sand assembled themselves into all this, this would be an explanation, but a stupid one, compared to the inference to intelligent design. So, in fact, the scientists say that even if we get radio signals in Morse code, they would be adequate to demonstrate the existence of intelligent life elsewhere. So, my point is, let's apply the reasonable standard. If we see a fine-tuned universe, what's more likely? Someone fine-tuned it, or it fine-tuned itself? Could the universe have created itself out of nothing? Is there some alternative explanation for the data at hand? No. So I'm simply saying, let's go with the best explanation. By the way, my argument isn't eternal. If 20 years from now you had a scientific argument that was better, that said, hey, we figured it all out, I would go with that. I would have to drop this argument. I'm saying that in the current mode of knowledge and thinking, this is a successful explanation. You can't change the subject and say, well, now explain the Holocaust. That requires a different set of rebuttals. I would say the Holocaust is the product of free will. God didn't do the Holocaust, Hitler did. The Nazis did. To try to deflect blame to God for human action voluntarily undertaken is to minimize the human capacity for evil. But whether or not that argument works, it has nothing to do with the design argument. And finally, morality, very briefly. Again, if evolution could adequately account for morality, let's remember that the atheist premise is that we are evolved creatures in the world, and that's it. So evolution has to do a lot of work. It has to explain the human desire to give blood to strangers. If it can't do that, then it fails as an adequate explanation for a very important form of human behavior, morality, that is seen in every culture known to man. It requires explanation. I have an alternative explanation. That in human beings there are two parts. We are evolutionary creatures in the world. That explains why we desire sex and we desire food to survive, to reproduce. But then I have this other thing inside of me, what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator. And that's another voice. And it's in me, but it's not of me. In fact, it's often stopping me from doing what I want to do. It's blocking my self-interest. Where does that come from? How does evolution account for that? So I'm saying that the God hypothesis casts more light on that subject, the hypothesis of a moral lawgiver. In fact, even the hypothesis of a life to come. You may say a final court in which our moral deeds will be adjudicated. Explains why we act the way we do now. Otherwise, our own behavior is incomprehensible to us. That's the strength of the presuppositional argument.
Well, because of religion's own very large claims. And because, it's something I didn't have time to go into, because not all these religions can be simultaneously true. I mean, there are enormous numbers of competing religions. It's another reason that it's obvious to me that they're man-made. It's what you would expect if it was man-made. There'd be lots of religions with incompatible claims and theologies, and that this would lead to further quarreling. Either one of them is completely true, as the Roman Church used to say, it was the one true church. Some of its members still do. Or all of them are false, or all of them are true, which of course can't be true. Now to Dinesh and the matter of anomalies and the question of ex nihilo. Half the time when I debate, it's people saying, nothing can come from nothing, you can't get something from nothing, so since there is something, someone must have wanted there to be something. Not, I think, a very impressive syllogism. I can't do it all this evening, but it's very easy for anyone to go and see Professor Lawrence Krauss deliver his brilliant lecture online called The Whole Universe from Nothing, which explains to you how indeed you can get very large numbers of things from nothing with the proper understanding of quantum theory. And then tonight Dinesh says, really there was nothing, and the Hebrews were so clever that they knew that. And therefore they must have been right about God as well. This is ridiculous. The ancient Hebrews also thought that God made man and women out of nothing or out of dust and clay, whereas we have an exact knowledge, or increasingly exact knowledge, of precisely the genetic materials in common with other creatures from which we were assembled. And then, not content with that, he says biblical prophecy is true in respect of Palestine. This is an extraordinary thing, and you were right to mention the Holocaust. If it's true that God wanted the Jews to get back to Palestine, then it must have been true that he wanted their exile to be ended, the galut, as it's known to Zionism, the exile, the wandering. And we know how that wandering was ended, by Christian Europe throwing living Jewish babies into furnaces. Well, that must be part of the plan then, mustn't it? And some rabbis used to claim that, by the way. They used to claim that the Holocaust was a punishment for exile. And then people started to desert the synagogue, so they shut up about it until the '67 war. And then when the Israeli army got the Wailing Wall back, they said, we shouldn't have spoken so quickly. Actually, this was what God always had in mind all along, the conquest by Jews of the Palestinians, where you see how brilliantly that's worked out. I don't think it's wise or moral or decent to try and detect the finger of God in human quarrels. I think the enterprise is futile, and it incidentally shows the absurdity of all arguments from design. Thank you.
Hitchens makes a strong point when he says the existence of many conflicting religions is exactly what we'd expect if they were man-made. Historically, we know that religions often reflect the geography, politics, and culture of their time. For example, Hinduism, Norse mythology, and Christianity all developed in isolation, making wildly different claims about gods, morality, and creation. They can't all be true, but they can all be human inventions. On the idea that something can't come from nothing, that's outdated thinking. Quantum physics shows that virtual particles appear and disappear in a vacuum with no cause. Lawrence Krauss explains in A Universe from Nothing that space, time, and even matter can emerge from quantum fluctuations. The universe doesn't need a creator. It needs laws of physics, which we have evidence for. And on the fine-tuning claim, that's misleading. The observable universe is mostly empty, dark, and hostile to life. If anything, it looks like a system that barely supports life, not one designed for it. Life adapted to the universe, not the other way around.
Well, was it to me first? Well, in that case, I can start with a compliment to Dinesh, because in one of his books, he tells the story of asking his father in India, Daddy, everyone around here seems to be Hindu, with quite a few Muslims. Why are we Christians? And his father said, because, Dinesh, my lad, the Portuguese Inquisition got to this part of India first. Which is, in fact, the full and complete explanation for that.
Actually,
so you can tell Dinesh was very well brought up in this respect, and he's made the most of it. Obviously, in my case, this does not apply because obviously, if you ask someone in Buffalo, why did you go to the Roman Catholic Church, he'll say, because my parents were from Poznan. It's the overwhelmingly probable explanation. Why did you go to a Greek Orthodox church? My parents were born in Thessaloniki. Of course this is true, but there are a lot of people who convert. In fact, quite a large number of Muslims on their way out of Islam embrace Christianity, which is a very risky thing to do. It must be something they care a lot about, and I think one should take seriously. And though it was relatively easy for me, being born in England and emigrating to America, to leave the Church of England behind, that, believe me, is no sweat. our great religious poet, our great Christian poet George Herbert refers to the sweet mediocrity of our native church. What do you get if you cross an Anglican with the Jehovah's Witness? Someone who comes to your door and bothers you for no particular reason. So, enough from me.
Well, I think we have an environmental explanation for Christopher's skepticism. He was raised in a religion that was based on the family values of Henry VIII. Enough said. Now, with regard to the Indian explanation, his explanation is true but incomplete. And here's the point. My grandfather did say that to me, and I began to read Indian history. And I realized that a handful of Portuguese missionaries, inquisitorial or not, would have a pretty hard time converting hundreds of thousands of people. And Indian historians who look at it have a better explanation. It's called the caste system. See, if you were born into the Hindu caste system and you were one of the guys on the lower rungs of the ladder, to put it somewhat bluntly, you were screwed. It didn't matter what merit you had, you couldn't rise up, and neither could your children. So along come these greedy missionaries, and maybe they had swords, but the truth of it is a lot of Indians were very eager to get out of the caste system. They didn't need the swords. They rushed into the arms of the missionaries because they promised something that the Hindus couldn't, universal brotherhood. It wasn't always practiced, but even the idea of it, the principle of it, was hugely appealing. And that's why there were mass conversions not only to Christianity, but also to Islam, which makes a similar promise. So this is the historical landscape. A final point about this is that we're committing here what could be called a genetic fallacy. We do it with religion. We always can see the fallacy if we apply it to any other area. For example, it is very probable that there are more people who believe in Darwin's theory of evolution who come from Oxford, England, than who come from Oxford, Mississippi. It's probably equally true that there are more people who believe in Einstein's theory of relativity who come from New York than who come from New Guinea. What does this say about whether Einstein's theory is correct or no? Nothing. The origins of your ideas have no bearing on whether they're true or not. So wherever Christopher and I got our ideologies or our religious convictions, you should weigh our arguments on the merits. Thank you.
Thank you both. Mr. D'Souza, you mentioned that you would only speak basically in secular terms, in terms of defending your faith without appealing to revelation or anything of that sort. Do you feel that there is an advantage for the world population at large for religious people to be required to defend their faith in such a venue, or do you feel that we would be better off if you had the luxury of only defending your faith within congregations of the faithful and without counterpart skeptics to demand that sort of intellectual line?
I've argued that I think that Christians need to learn to be bilingual. And by that I mean to speak perhaps two languages, a Christian language at home or in church, and a more secular language in the public square. Not because we want to wear two faces, but because we want to make our arguments accessible to people who may not share our assumptions. And so a lot of times, if someone says, you know, what do you think about gay marriage? The Christian opens to the book of Leviticus, not recognizing that the person he's talking to does not recognize the authority of Leviticus to decide the matter. So it becomes a futile enterprise, two ships in the night. The only way to have debate is to meet on some common ground. And in that sense, I think in a democratic society, the common ground of reason is a perfectly appropriate language for democratic discourse. So what we're doing here is a secular intellectual enterprise. If I was speaking, as I sometimes do, in a megachurch or at a Catholic event, I might speak in a little different language, but that's because I'm speaking to an audience with different assumptions.
Hitchens is right to point out that most people follow the religion of their parents. It's geography and culture, not truth, that shapes belief. If you're born in Pakistan, you'll probably be Muslim. If you're born in Italy, Catholic. That alone should make us pause before declaring any one religion right. Now, D'Souza brings up caste as a reason for mass conversions in India. But this doesn't prove Christianity is true. It shows how social inequality can make oppressed people more open to any system that promises dignity. The same pattern happened with Islam and even communism. People seek escape, not necessarily truth. And calling that a genetic fallacy misses the point. Of course, ideas should be judged on merit. But when most people inherit religion instead of choosing it freely, that matters. Unlike science, which demands evidence and can be tested, religion often discourages doubt. Hitchens' argument isn't about where ideas come from. It's about how they spread. And on that, the evidence is clear. Belief is mostly born, not earned.
It is true that one can always, by re-rigging the assumptions, create new probabilities. So, for example, there are many physicists who have computed that if you look at all the particles of matter in the entire universe, the chance of them randomly assembling to produce a cell is essentially zero. However, you can increase that probability by adding universes. And there are many cosmologists who say, well, what if there are 1,000 universes or an infinity of universes? Then, in the infinity of time, and that's a problematic statement in itself, but with an infinity of universes, an infinity of transactions, even improbable events do occur. The problem with that is you can call it not only a scandalous violation of Occam's razor, it's essentially syllogistic promiscuity. Because what is the evidence that there is even one other universe other than our own? Empirically, none. You're essentially making up universes to account for the anomalies of the universe we have. So, which is more likely? It's almost as if the atheist, to try to abolish one invisible God, has to fabricate an infinity of invisible universes. I mean, I'd like to believe that, but frankly, I don't have that much faith.
The person violating the principle of William of Ockham here, I think, though, Dinesh, is you. I mean, everyone remembers what Laplace said to Napoleon when he produced he was the greatest scientist of his day, his orrery, the solar system as viewed from the outside, never been done before in model form. And the emperor said, well, there doesn't seem to be any God in this apparatus. And Laplace said, well, Your Majesty, it happens to operate perfectly well without that assumption. So it does. Dinesh asked earlier, and I should have taken him up on it, isn't it the case that to the three questions, where are we coming, where are we from, where are we going, and why are we here, there are three nopes from our side. That's not true at all. It was incredible that he alleged it. So the question of where are we from, both in the macro and the micro term, where did we come from, the cosmological, the Big Bang, and the micro, the unraveling of the human string of DNA and our kinship with other animals and indeed other forms of non-animal life, we are to an enormously greater extent well informed about our origins. And what we don't know, we don't claim to know. Very important. My admitting that I don't know exactly how it began is not at all the same as Dinesh's admission that he doesn't know either, because he feels he has to know. Because if it's not a matter of faith and it's not a matter of God, he can't say he believes in it a little bit. It must be a real belief to be genuine, and it must have some explanatory value. And he doesn't hold it very strongly, and it doesn't explain anything for which we have better explanations. Likewise about where we are going. We have a very good idea now of the time and place, if you like, the time anyway, when our universe and our sun, and indeed the cosmos, will come to an end. Dinesh might say, well, then if you look at the Bible, it proves right all those who said the end of the world is at hand. There's biblical authority. In fact, it just proves we were right all along. Yes, except that they said that by repenting, you could prevent this outcome, which you cannot, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? As to why are we here, good question, to which there's so far no perfect answer, and I suggest you keep the argument about that open and sharpen the questions and consider the infinite possible variety of answers and train your mind that way. Don't say you already know why you're here, that someone wants you to be here, that you're fathered, that you're protected, that it's all part of a divine plan. You can't know that, and you shouldn't say it. There.
I want to get back to the basics of this debate, and Professor D'Souza, you touched on this a little bit using the free will argument. I want to know how you can reconcile your statement that belief is a good thing when so many lives have been lost due to the differing opinions of religious views.
That is true, although historically greatly overstated. The Inquisition. When I was a student at Dartmouth, if you had asked me how many people were killed in the Inquisition, I would have said hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, horrible blot on Western history. Truth of it is, these things are now carefully studied. Henry came in as a multi-volume study of the Inquisition. Spanish Inquisition was the worst. And over 350 years, the number of people killed in the Inquisition was fewer than 2,000. Now, 2,000 people, 350 years, it works out to about 5 guys a year. Not normally considered a world historical crime. Now, is that 2,000 too many? Yes. But my point is that while the atheists are often crying crocodile tears over the crimes of religion, crimes that, by the way, often occurred 500 or 1,000 years ago, what about the vastly greater crimes of atheist regimes committed in our own lifetime in the last century, and they are still going on? If you take Hitler, Stalin, and Mao alone, the three of them collectively in the space of a few decades killed close to 100 million people. And that's the tip of the iceberg. What about Ceausescu, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot? Pol Pot, he's a junior league atheist. Normally you don't even name the guy. But his Khmer Rouge regime in Indochina, following the Vietnam War, kills about 2 million in about 3 years. 2 million! Even bin Laden in his wildest dreams doesn't even come close. So I'm all for looking at the historical record, but let's look at it fairly and not blame religion for crimes when there are vastly greater and more recent crimes committed by atheist regimes. Let's look at all sides of the ledger.
There's a factual and a theoretical comment to be made on that. First, I think you're flat out wrong on the Inquisition. Not that the numbers game is crucial, but the Inquisition in the Americas caused Father Bartolomeo de las Casas to convene a great meeting at the University of Salamanca to consider whether the Christian world should ever have gone as conquistadors, because the genocidal price paid by the people of old Colombia, pre-Colombia, was so high. Slavery, torture, burning. No one knows what the numbers are, but they're horrifying. The second, the 30 Years' War has to be considered a war of religion, and we don't know how many people were killed there either, but the retarding of civilization was absolutely gigantic, as well as the appalling harvest of innocent population. Third, at the beginning of the First World War, a clash of empires, all of the imperial leaders were, in a sense, theocrats. The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy by definition. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the head of the Protestant Church in Germany. The Tsar of Russia was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. The King Emperor of Britain, George V, was the head of the Church of England, as you say, rightly founded on the family values of Henry VIII. Civilization has not recovered from the retarding process of that war either. In fact, we never will get over what happened in that war. And those are wars of religion. Just to stay with the point of fact and on the secular, the allegation that the other killers are secular. Of the first one you mentioned, Adolf Hitler, it has to be said that I can almost give you the page reference of Mein Kampf, where he says that his desire to slaughter the Jews is because his fealty to the work of the Lord. He regards it as a holy cause. That's in Mein Kampf. Maybe he doesn't have the authority to say that, but you can't call him secular. On the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier, it read, Gott mit uns, every single one of them, God on our side. Just as the Confederacy had Deo Vindice as its official motto in the Civil War for slavery. It's been calculated by the Catholic historian Paul Johnson that up to 1/3 of the SS were confessing Catholics. If you change the word fascism, if you take it out of the history of the 1930s, just remove it, pretend it doesn't exist, call it a propaganda word, insert instead extreme Christian right wing, you have not to alter, you don't have to alter a thing about the spread of fascism from Portugal through Spain, across to Croatia, to Slovakia, where the head of the Nazi puppet regime was a priest in holy orders, Father Tiso. Vichy, Austria, you know the story, or if you don't, you should. Or anyone here who considers himself a Catholic should know that. This is not, I'm sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen, secularism. Of the others, I would actually say Pol Pot had a very extreme idea of a restoration of the old Buddhist authority known as the Angkar. But let me not quarrel too much. What was wrong with these heroic mass murderers? That they all thought that they could bring about an ultimate history. They all thought that with them, history would be consummated. History would in fact come to an end. They were messianic. The whole problem to begin with is the idea that human beings can be perfected by force, or by faith, or by conquest, or by inquisition. That can take an explicitly religious form or just another messianic form, but it reinforces the point I began with. Take nothing for certain. Don't believe in any absolutism. Don't believe in any totalitarianism. Don't ask for any supreme leader in the sky or on earth, for that way lies madness and torture and murder, and always will.
Hitchens is right to point out that the worst atrocities in history were driven not just by ideology, but by certainty, the belief that some higher cause justifies inhuman actions. Religion has a long track record of this. The 30 Years' War alone killed over 8 million people in the name of competing Christian doctrines. The Crusades, colonial missionary violence, and forced conversions during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions wiped out entire cultures. The numbers are often minimized by apologists, but that's not honesty, it's revisionism. D'Souza falsely equates secular authoritarianism with atheism. Stalin's regime didn't kill in the name of atheism. It killed to maintain power, just like the Christian monarchies that did the same with divine right. And Hitler wasn't an atheist. His writings and speeches often invoked God, providence, and divine mission. The Nazi Party signed a concordat with the Vatican in 1933 and was supported by many Catholic leaders. Their motto, Gott mit uns, God with us, was stamped on every soldier's belt buckle. And about science, yes, the multiverse is a theory. But unlike God, it's derived from real physics. Quantum field theory, cosmic inflation, and string theory all predict the possibility of multiple universes. No faith needed, just math, observation, and peer review. Hitchens' warning is simple. Belief in unquestionable truths, whether religious or political, creates the conditions for totalitarianism. History proves him right. Do you think society is safer when people admit they don't know everything, or when they claim divine authority over everyone else?
Where do we get the idea for human rights and human equality? You cannot cut open a human being and discover in their DNA human equality. It's not the sort of thing that Plato or Aristotle believed in. Of course, there are citizens and there are barbarians, and there are males and there are females, and there are slaves and there are free people, and we live within a hierarchy. And as Bart has already said about the paterfamilias, there is a person at the top of that hierarchy who is in this priestly role, who has incredible rights over the lives and bodies of everyone else, within that structure. And I guess I begin the book with equality because I want to go back to Genesis 1 and say on page 1 in the beginning, we've got male and female in God's image to have dominion over the world. And I think that's a radically different creation account to the ancient Near Eastern accounts, to the Greek and Roman myths, to the Egyptian myths, in which there are chaotic forces at play and humanity are made as slaves for the gods. And in Genesis 1, you've got humanity as having dominion. It's God's world, but he puts humans in charge. So you have this incredible dignity that is given to the human person. And one of the people I reference in the book is Celsus in the 2nd century, a great critic of Christianity, who talks about the radical error of Jews and Christians. And radical error number 1 is this Hebrew idea that God uniquely blesses humans. Why should that be the case? Mm-hmm. But that radical error is compounded by the Christians who come along and say, not only does God uniquely bless humans, God uniquely becomes human in the person of Jesus. And so you've got this foundation for humanism in God the human. And no wonder you can get the Apostle Paul coming along later in Galatians and saying there's no male, no female, slave, no free, Jew nor Gentile, because we're all one in Christ Jesus. Modeled within the church, you start to get this idea of a different kind of family in which everyone, no matter their station, is a brother or a sister, and no one is Lord except Christ. And obviously, it takes a long time, like yeast working through dough, like the mustard seed growing, until we get modern ideas of equality. But I think very specifically, these have come from biblical and particularly Christian foundations.
Glenn points to Genesis and early Christian teachings as the foundation of equality. But that doesn't hold up when we look at the facts. The Bible, both Old and New Testament, clearly supports slavery, patriarchal dominance, and the subordination of women. In Exodus 21, slave ownership is explicitly regulated, not condemned. In the New Testament, Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. He doesn't call for abolition. Women are told to remain silent and submit. This isn't hidden. It was used to justify inequality for centuries. Christian empires ran the transatlantic slave trade. The church opposed women's suffrage. Even the idea of consent in marriage wasn't accepted until secular law overrode religious norms. The real turning point came during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Mary Wollstonecraft challenged religious authority and pushed ideas of freedom, equality, and universal rights, based on reason, not scripture. So no, modern human rights didn't come from Christianity. They emerged in spite of it, through centuries of struggle against the very hierarchies religion helped build. Let's hear what Bart has to say about that.
You know, when you go back to the creation stories, I think the most troubling thing is not Genesis 1, but Genesis 2, when you have the detailed description. I assume you're talking about the equality of humans, because Genesis 1 is not about equality of living beings, because the whole point is humans have the entire creation be subordinate to humans.
Dominion.
And so the question is, are men and women created equally? And I get your point from Genesis 1. When you have the account in Genesis 2 about how it actually happens, God first makes Adam and makes Adam a living being, and then Adam needs a helper, and so he creates all the animals, and these are to be his helpers. But it turns out there's no one suitable, so he makes a woman out of the man, an isha out of the ish in Hebrew, and she's to be his helper, his helpmate. That's why she exists. He does not come into being to help her. She comes into being to help him, and then she leads him astray, according to the biblical record. And this is the consistent motif throughout the Bible, is that women are to be subordinate to men. There are, it's massively evident when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And when in the New Testament, where you have somebody pick up this story from Genesis 2, it's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where the author, claiming to be Paul, says that women are not to talk in church. They're to exercise no authority over a man. They're to be subject to men, because Eve was misled, not Adam. And this is what happens when women teach. They get misled by the devil and they lead the man astray. You get a similar thing in Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 14 about women are not to talk in church. So it's true that Galatians does say that in Christ there's no male or female or slave or free, and that's absolutely true, and it's absolutely important that he says that. But the two key words are in Christ. What he means is that everybody equally gets salvation. But Paul does not think that they are equal in the church. He tells the women in Corinth that they are to be subject to their husbands, just as the husbands are subject to God. And so the husband is their God. And so this is not equality on any social level. And if you look at the history of Christianity, I don't think anyone would look at the history of Christianity through late antiquity or the Middle Ages into the Reformation and would think that Christianity supported equality for all human beings. They simply didn't. It's not until the Enlightenment that comes about. And the people who developed this in the Enlightenment were not always Christians. In fact, most of them weren't Christian in any sense that you would recognize. And so you have I would agree, you have kind of the roots there You have the roots in also other forms of ancient thought, though. I don't know if you've looked into Stoicism, but in the Stoic world also you have various traces of this. And so the Enlightenment does have earlier traces, but I don't think it's an exclusively Christian concept, and I don't think it's a particularly Christian concept because, in fact, Christianity supports subordination, not equality.
Okay. Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we might need the 7 hours. Okay. So the fact that Adam comes first within the Genesis narrative means that he is more primitive, because we go from very simple things in Genesis to much more complex things. And in terms of Adam, we go from dust to man to woman. And she is, if Adam is the head of creation, Eve is the crown. And so I think if you just follow literarily what is going on in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't get the sense of Eve being a lesser, but actually a more developed creature than Adam is. And the fact that she is the helper, the Ezer, is that, you know, God is most commonly spoken of as our help, in that we cannot live without him. We need help. We desperately need help. And so the helper does not mean it's a diminutive role at all, I would say. And then it's interesting where does the feminist impulse come from? And you have said that Galatians is very important in that. I would say the treatment of women by Christ was radically countercultural in the day. That the marriage and family program, as Joseph Henrich has put the sort of the early church sexual ethic of the day, was radically equalizing in terms of its expectations of men and women. I get into this in my consent chapter, that if the sexual revolution of the 1960s equalized the sexes by saying women can be as freed as men have always been sexually, the first century sexual revolution was basically men must be as restricted as women have always been. And in a sense, very, very few things I would say have ever been as liberating for women and children than that first century sexual revolution, in which men are utterly restricted to the levels of modesty and chastity that were always expected of women. And I'm not saying that in the first century we have a fully blown sense of the UN Declaration of Human Rights or of any of that, but I am saying that exclusively and particularly it is a Christian understanding that is developing. And then when you get into the idea of, did these ideas come from the Enlightenment? I tend to think that that's more a creationist narrative, that sort of out of nowhere has come these ideas of equality without a backstory. And I would just encourage people to be more evolutionary in their thinking, in a theistic sense, that actually what was developed through the Enlightenment and on into the modern world were foundationally Christian views that I don't think you would get without those Christian foundations.
I mean, what do you just quickly say to the Bart saying the concept of equality was also floating around in Stoicism and other ancient forms of thought and philosophy? Perhaps it was just Christianity that kind of was the vehicle that really, you know, took it forward eventually because of the triumph of Christianity. But do you think it was there otherwise, Glenn?
You can point to all sorts of things that we look back now through glasses and through a prism that can point out things in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures that we can applaud, including, you know, any traces of equality that we see in Stoicism. I guess my question would be, why are we looking for those particular things? And I would say that the reason we're looking for those particular things is we're coming from an irreducibly Christian mindset that is looking for those particular things.
So can I respond to some of that, Justin?
Please.
I mean, I don't think it's irreducibly Christian, because if you're going to do an evolutionary model, of course, Christianity came out of other things too. It's not really fair to isolate Christianity, for example, apart from Judaism. And so you could just as well write the book saying that it's not a Christian model, it's a Jewish model. So I think that the lens you're looking at as a Christian theologian is Christianity, but if you look at it historically, I don't think it works. When you look, and I don't think the Enlightenment came out of nowhere at all. I think there definitely were roots, and some of them were Christian and some weren't. As to Adam and Eve, though, I've got to say I don't think the logic works. I love the idea that Eve is the pinnacle. That God saved the best for last. That's great. But if you follow that logic, what you're saying is, first God creates the other animals to help Adam. And if he's more primitive than Eve because he was first, that means he's more primitive than the animals, which means that spiders and snakes and aardvarks are superior to humans in that scheme.
The animals are already there. He just hadn't named them.
No, God made them in order to help him. That's why he made.
God brought the animals to him, but
the animals are created.
After.
The animals are created, at least in the first chapter of Genesis. The animals get created on whatever it is, day 4 or 5.
I'm not talking about the first. As you know, look, this is another long issue. But first, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different stories. Eve does not show up in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2, and Glenn is presupposing Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, when he says that Eve came second. So I'm talking about what he's talking about, Eve coming second. She doesn't come second, she comes after the animals. And so if she's superior to Adam because she was made as his helper, the animals are made as his helpers.
They're not made. They're not made. They were brought to him. They were brought to him. They weren't made. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. That God makes the animals in order to help Adam. He names them, but they're only after they're made.
Bart's completely right to highlight that Genesis 2 is deeply rooted in hierarchy, not equality. And the proof isn't just in the story, it's in how that story was used for centuries to justify male dominance and female subordination in Christian doctrine, law, and society. Take 1 Timothy 2:11-15, used for over 1,800 years to deny women leadership, silence them in church, and justify that their nature is more easily deceived. This wasn't fringe theology, it was mainstream. Influential figures like Augustine, Tertullian, and Aquinas all reinforced the idea that women were inferior by nature. Aquinas even wrote that women are defective and misbegotten men, a conclusion drawn straight from Christian interpretations of Genesis. The idea that Jesus introduced gender equality doesn't match the facts. There's no gospel record of Jesus calling for the end of patriarchy or slavery. He didn't challenge the legal inferiority of women, or say anything about women's rights to divorce, own property, or testify in court. Things women in Roman society were often denied. Glenn's claim that the early church equalized sexual expectations between men and women is misleading. The early Christian sexual ethic wasn't about freedom or fairness, it was about control, especially over women's bodies. Church fathers idealized virginity and celibacy, especially for women, and viewed sex even in marriage as suspect. Jerome, one of Christianity's most influential thinkers, said, "Nothing is so unclean as a woman's body." That's not a foundation of equality, that's institutional misogyny. And the idea that Christianity slowly evolved into modern human rights is revisionist. Real legal equality and consent laws didn't emerge from churches. They were won against the churches by secular thinkers during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment didn't come out of nowhere, but its core principles, freedom of thought, bodily autonomy, equality before the law, often clashed with Christian orthodoxy. Thinkers like Spinoza, Hume, Voltaire, and Paine questioned divine authority and rooted human rights in reason and shared experience, not in divine revelation. That's where real equality began to take legal shape. Christian institutions resisted these ideas, sometimes violently. And even the idea of consent in marriage, the church didn't teach that marital rape was wrong until the late 20th century. In fact, marital rape was legal in most Christian countries until feminist, secular movements challenged the doctrine that wives owed sex to their husbands, a view grounded in centuries of Christian theology. So Glenn's idea that Christianity planted the seeds of equality just doesn't hold up. What history shows is that Christianity institutionalized hierarchy, and that human equality had to be wrestled out of its grip by people brave enough to question its authority.
let's start with you here. Why do you believe that Christianity did give us that sense? And then we'll see what Bart has to say.
I think there is kindness and there's compassion in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures. So it's like, I don't want to be heard to say that Christianity has a monopoly on kindness, on tender-heartedness, on love. But I think there is something unique about the highest becoming the lowest on the cross, in order that we, the lowest, might be brought into his hospitality. You know, if the way of all nature is the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest, the Christian story is the sacrifice of the fittest, Christ, so that we, the weakest, might survive. And I think whereas in the realm of nature it is tit for tat, in the realm of nature it is nature red in tooth and claw, there is something supernatural about the way of Christ. There's something against nature. There is something that says, I will protect the weakest. And obviously it was something that a critic of the church like Nietzsche hated. He saw the cross as the transvaluation of all values. Because, of course, nature teaches us that the weak, the low, and the botched should perish, and we shall help them to do so, he says in the Antichrist. And therefore, Christians have always, he thought, stood in the way of a proper humanitarian ideal. And the proper humanitarian ideal is we can all fly off to become Übermensch. We can all fly off to greater heights of humanity if we let the poor, the weak, the low, and the botched, as he called them, perish, so that we can, evolve to a higher degree. I think the revulsion that we feel at that sentiment is a particularly Christian revulsion, and it is born of some particularly Christian intuitions. I think we've been looking at a picture of the Lord on the cross for thousands of years, and we have held that up as our image of what it is to be great. And whoever will be greatest among you must serve, and the first shall be last, and all that kind of stuff that Jesus taught. I think we have been formed, whether we've been to church or not, all of us have been formed by an image of greatness in sacrifice, and even shameful sacrifice on the cross for the sake of the other, which I think gives a bite to a Christian understanding of compassion.
And how, just before we come back to Bart, was that, in your view, shown in practical ways by the early Christian church?
Hospitals, for instance, would be an interesting place to go. Now that the Greeks had their manuals of how Galen's four humours and how to be a physician and to help people, and the Romans had their sort of sick bays for the slaves and the soldiers, but that was to restore them to economic and military fruitfulness. The idea of hospitals for the weak and the poor and the sick who could not afford it became a very much a Christian thing that happened, and there was a cascade of hospitals that sort of happened from the 4th century onwards. Would be one kind of thing, or standing against abortion and infanticide, and not simply standing against abortion and infanticide, but taking the exposed infants and raising them in orphan care and that sort of thing. That would be another way of actually standing against the way of nature.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Bart, that in those pagan cultures, it was legal, essentially, to abandon and expose, as it was called, infants who were unwanted economically, or because they were malformed or whatever it was. And as I understand it, Christians became to be known for people who would go to those places where they were traditionally left and took them in and adopted them and so on. For this is a part of a big picture that Glenn believes goes back to this idea of the God who was willing to be sacrificed and kind of upheld the poor and the lowly and so on over the powerful. What's your view on that as being the kind of the linchpin for where this central virtue of compassion as a value came from in Western culture?
I've got two things to say about it. One is this is the one area of Glenn's book that I completely agree with in most ways. I would put it differently. The way not contradictorily. It just a different way. My different way of thinking about it is, I actually deal with this in this book that just came out with Yale about my journeys to the afterlife, because some of them deal with these issues of, and it's the issue is that in the Roman world generally, the ancient world generally, the world generally, the ideology was one of dominance. That whoever was dominant, there were no ethical problems with a person who was dominating somebody. That's what they were supposed to do. And so a powerful village there was no ethical problem with destroying the village next door, if you're more, and killing all the men and enslaving all the women. There wasn't an ethical problem with that. Or empires. And so you can read through the moral discourses of Romans and Greeks, and they don't problematize that. They don't problematize slavery. Of course, I mean, the master is supposed to be master of the slave, and so slavery is fine. Yeah, of course. They're usually prisoners of war in the ancient world. It wasn't a race thing. It was just, you enslave people. And men were to dominate women economically, socially, culturally, politically, sexually. And so it was all domination, and Jesus preached service. And it was completely contrary to what the dominant paradigm was that you're to serve others and to live for and to help the poor. And that's when, in the ancient world, if you had a lot of money and if you had to give some away or you did give some away, it was always to somebody on your same socioeconomic class, or to build a public building, or to put on a gladiatorial show, or something like. It was for your own, to promote your own status. The idea of helping the poor was like unheard of. It's like, are you kidding me? That's a joke. No, you're not going to help the poor. And so I completely agree with that is a paradigm shift. It's not the case that everybody accepted the paradigm. A lot of Christians were going around saying, yeah, Jesus said to sell everything. He didn't really mean it. And so, you get a lot of that, and people are people. But you do get the shift in how preachers preached it. The other thing I would say, though, is that it doesn't originate with Christianity. Jesus is pulling on the Old Testament prophets. It originates with Judaism. What Christianity did is it took over the world. And so this Jewish idea of love your neighbor as yourself became a dominant paradigm in the West, at least theoretically, because of Christianity. I agree with that. And it's true, you get hospitals and you get orphanages, and you get the weird idea that you're concerned about the destitute. Ancient pagans talk about it and they say, what? No, we're not doing that.
Bart makes two important points here, and they both stand up to history. First, the idea that caring for the poor and weak was some radical new Christian invention just isn't true. That moral shift began long before Jesus, in Judaism through prophets like Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, who condemned the rich for exploiting the poor and called on the people to care for widows, orphans, and the oppressed. Jesus was teaching in that tradition, not creating something new. Second, even when Christianity became dominant, it didn't consistently follow its own ideals. Yes, some Christians rescued infants, built hospitals, and preached compassion. But these were exceptions, not norms. For most of church history, the poor were still exploited, slavery was normalized, and church institutions amassed enormous wealth while preaching humility. Even monastic hospitals, which Glenn praises, were often limited to serving other Christians, sometimes only clergy, and could exclude the very people Jesus supposedly came to help. The compassion that survived did so because people, not institutions, fought to keep it alive. And let's not forget, many non-Christian cultures also built systems of care. In India, Buddhist monastic hospitals predate Christian ones. In China, Confucian ethics promoted caring for the vulnerable. The idea that only Christianity cared for the weak is not just inaccurate, it's dismissive of the full human story. Bart is right. Christianity spread a Jewish ethic, but it didn't originate it, and it often failed to practice it. The values we hold today, compassion, consent, equality, were won through a long, difficult evolution, often in spite of religion, not because of it. What do you think? Do you believe religion is necessary for morality, or can human values grow without it?
I want to make it very clear that I'm not postulating a sort of God of the gaps this evening to plug up holes in scientific knowledge. Rather, my claim is that science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to the conclusion that God exists.
Philosophers and their obfuscating cousins, the theologians, has puzzled for centuries over the purpose of the universe. Why did God make it? Boredom with absolutely nothing? Anxious for admirers? Keen that we should have the pleasures and the pains of existence? The trouble is, there is absolutely no evidence that the universe has any purpose whatsoever. Now, as you've just heard, some assert that the universe can spring from a quantum fluctuation. That may be true of a daughter universe, for an already existing mother universe has physical laws and a richly propertied vacuum. But when there is absolutely nothing, there are no physical laws, no quantum fluctuation. It's an empty term for the emergence of an original universe. And to make things harder for myself, but with an eye on trying to answer and not evade a deeply important question, I shall set aside the simpler problem of a daughter universe and consider the formation of an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality, which is essentially the working out of the consequences of physical laws, to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event. And what science has to do, in due course, is to discover how absolutely nothing can tumble into being and become apparently something. Is there any reason to believe that it might succeed? There's no doubt that it's actually edging towards that goal by burrowing back in time to discover that there was what there was immediately after the creation event. Look how far it has come in the past 100 years. We are starting to be confident about what first appeared, and we are certainly becoming aware of what needs to be known, such as refinements and perhaps replacements of general relativity and quantum theory. Once we know the nature of the newly formed universe, we can begin to speculate, as some actually already have, about the nature of the events that has given us the impression that there is something here in place of absolutely nothing. To say that we now have any knowledge at all about how it could happen would be a lie. But to say at this stage, and after so much progress, that God did it, would be a premature admission of defeat. There is currently no need for a creator God. Secondly, fitness. One role of God, it is argued, is to choose the values of the fundamental constants so that images of him can emerge. I will discount the evidence that God has an apparently greater interest in ensuring the presence of gas and rocks rather than organisms, and concede the fact that this universe has properties that allow for the emergence of life. There are two principal arguments that throw into doubt that a thoughtful God was involved in the design of the universe. First, it could be the case that only a certain mix of fundamental constants could come into existence for a viable universe, and the fact that they allow life is just a happy accident. Second, it could be the case, and theoretical models give some credence to it, that ours is not the only universe. And if there is more than one universe, then there is no obvious reason why there is not an infinite number of universes. Why stop at 2? Why stop at 42? It could be that all those universes have the same mix of fundamental constants, each one allowing life. Or it could be that the fundamental constants take random values, and it is inevitable that one, or even an infinity of them, permits the emergence of life. No design appears to be necessary, and an argument that posits an essential designer God is lazy rather than convincing. There is currently no need for a designer God.
What Atkins is saying lines up with modern cosmology. Quantum physics shows us that particles can emerge from what looks like nothing. The Casimir effect is one example, where measurable forces arise in a vacuum due to quantum fluctuations. Physicists like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss have argued that universes can originate from quantum states without needing a divine push. When Christians claim God fine-tuned the universe, it ignores two things. First, the universe is mostly hostile to life. 99.9999% is empty space, radiation, and gas. If it was designed for humans, it's a very inefficient design. Second, theories like eternal inflation and string theory predict multiverses, where different universes could have different constants. In that case, life existing here is just statistical inevitability, not evidence of design. Historically, invoking God to explain gaps in knowledge has failed. People once believed lightning, disease, and earthquakes were divine acts until science explained them. This is exactly what God of the gaps thinking looks like. Even the Bible reflects pre-scientific cosmology, a flat earth under a firmament in Genesis 1:6-8, which shows it isn't a reliable source of cosmology.
Thirdly, purpose. Philosophers and their obfuscating cousins, the theologians, has puzzled for centuries over the purpose of the universe. Why did God make it? Boredom with absolutely nothing? Anxious for admirers? Keen that we should have the pleasures and the pains of existence? The trouble is, there is absolutely no evidence that the universe has any purpose whatsoever. This, like causality, is an extrapolation of puny human experience to an inappropriate cosmic scale. Each of us, of course, has purposes of various kinds, and so surely, they say, the universe has one too. Science proceeds to elucidate the workings of the world without invoking purpose, and finds not one jot of evidence for it. In fact, in my view, there is a grandeur in an entity as great as a universe, just hanging there, wholly without purpose. And if there is no purpose, there is no need to posit a purposeful God. Fourthly, miracles. I shall adopt the perhaps naive but common view that a miracle involves the suspension of natural law. Miracles of that kind have never, ever been observed. There is not one atom of reliable evidence that God has ever intervened in the world to suspend his laws. That the path to canonization requires physicians to certify that an event cannot be explained except by God responding to intercession by a candidate saint should result in the physicians being struck off for incompetence if they aver that a cure has no natural explanation. Even that great, pivotal, purported miracle, the resurrection, is a total fabrication, with other explanations far more cogent than anything divine. Even given that Jesus existed and was crucified, was he merely in a coma? Was his disappearance a cover-up for political reasons? Was it Golgotha Gate? Did the women forget which of the many post-crucifixion holes in the ground he was buried in? The Gospels are wholly unreliable, being politically motivated propaganda manifestos written long after the events they purport to report. As no miracle has ever occurred, to assert that miracles are evidence for God is an empty argument. Theodicy. that an all-loving God permits evil to stalk the world, including, most dreadfully, the unconscious evil of evolution by natural selection, has puzzled theologians since the beginning of time, and all manner of convoluted explanations have been proposed. There is, of course, an extraordinarily simple explanation. There is no all-loving God. Indeed, to anyone with an open mind, the existence of evil, the torment, accident and neighbour visited upon the innocent, is in fact evidence against the existence of God. Morality, my sixth and final point. God is commonly presumed to be the fountainhead of love, and as such, the source of the distinction between good and evil. In my view, the distinction has emerged in the course of our evolutionary history. But it is not, it's not just the consequence of red in tooth and claw. Red in tooth and claw is coated in the milk of human kindness by our emerging ability to consider the consequences of our actions. To discover the roots of ethics, we might consult the so-called holy books for a variety of anecdotes and experiences that might match our own. But to understand the source of the distinction, we need to examine our ethological history, perhaps history itself, and certainly anthropology and psychology. Just as good manners have emerged for the sake of decorum and the avoidance of offense, so good behavior has emerged for the sake of survival. It is childish to presume that there is an umpire God, and adult to consider how our actions stabilize society. I've considered some of the arguments that purport to establish the existence of God and have shown that they carry little force. In every case, there is a more cogent, or at least greater the likelihood of discovering a more cogent explanation. I can understand why the notion of God has arisen and persisted, for it provides a simple, purported explanation of great matters. It is a comfort blanket for the anxious and deprived, and it is a powerful weapon of control. You have a choice: to accept on faith alone that there is a God, and lie back, luxuriating in the foam of satisfaction. There is no longer any need to think. For why pursue the incomprehensible any further than comforting assertion? Or you can take delight in the power of the collective human intellect, an intellect that burrows into experiences, is currently in hot pursuit of comprehension on this side of the grave, and adds to life the delight of true understanding. Thank you very much.
When Atkins points out that the universe shows no purpose, science backs that up. The cosmos is mostly chaos, supernovae, black holes, an endless void. If there were a divine plan, it's strange that 99.9% of creation is hostile to life. Miracles don't solve this problem either. No verifiable miracle has ever been documented. The resurrection, often cited as proof, is recorded in texts written decades later, with contradictions between Gospels and no independent evidence. As David Hume argued, it's always more likely the testimony is flawed than that natural law was suspended. Then there's the problem of evil. Earthquakes, disease, and the brutality of evolution all suggest indifference, not divine love. Even Christian thinkers like Augustine struggled with this, but their answers never resolved why innocent suffering is allowed by an all-powerful God. Finally, morality is better explained by evolution and society than by religion. Studies in evolutionary psychology show cooperation and empathy helped humans survive long before Christianity existed. And the Bible itself permits slavery and violence, proving it's not the source of universal ethics.
First, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now let's turn to that second contention, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. In his opening speech, Dr. Atkins more or less admitted this. He said that I cannot prove that God does not exist. I can only show that God is not necessary. Well, now notice that merely leaves you with agnosticism, that is to say, the position that you don't know whether or not God exists. And that's not incompatible with the existence of God or even Christian theism. Indeed, many Christian theologians hold the position that there aren't good arguments for God's existence. I disagree with them, but nevertheless, that's consistent with a Christian position. So, at most, we're left with agnosticism. Secondly, Dr. Atkins also says that he rejects any sort of God of the gaps approach. There's nothing in the universe that cannot be scientifically explained. Now, he admits that's merely a promissory note. He takes that by faith. But nevertheless, I want to make it very clear that I'm not postulating a sort of God of the gaps this evening to plug up holes in scientific knowledge. Rather, my claim is that science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to the conclusion that God exists. For example, in my cosmological argument, there's scientific evidence for that key premise that the universe began to exist. So science does help, I think, to establish theism, not directly but indirectly by supplying evidence for a premise in a philosophical argument leading to a theological conclusion. And so I want to insist as clearly as I can that this is not a debate between science and religion tonight. On the contrary, I think that science provides good evidence for premises in arguments that have theologically significant conclusions. Finally, he does allude very briefly to the problem of evil, saying that this makes it unlikely that God exists. Now, what Dr. Atkins seems to be saying here, although he didn't flesh out this argument, is there's some kind of an inconsistency between the statement God exists and evil exists. But the problem is those two statements are not logically contradictory with each other. And therefore, the atheist must be assuming some implicit premises, some hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit. The problem is no atheist has ever been able to identify what those hidden premises are. And if Dr. Atkins knows what they are, then I will ask him to please share them with us and to show us that those premises are necessarily true, because unless and until he does that, he hasn't shown any incompatibility between God and the evil in the world. Indeed, I would say that we can actually go one step further. We can actually show that God and the evil in the world are consistent. To do that, all you need to do is find a third statement that is composable or consistent with God's existence that entails that evil exists. Here's such a statement. God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that is even possibly true, it shows that God and evil are logically consistent with each other. So Dr. Atkins would have to show us that it is impossible that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil in the world. And in so doing, he will have taken on a burden of proof that is simply unsustainable by the atheist. The prominent metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen says, it used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended, not even by atheists. So we've not heard any good arguments for atheism this evening. What about my arguments on behalf of theism? First, I argued that the origin of the universe points to the existence of God. I argued first that the universe began to exist, and I presented both philosophical arguments and scientific evidence in support of that premise, and Dr. Atkins doesn't deny it. Then I said, if the universe did begin to exist, then there was a transcendent cause of the universe which brought it into being. And here Dr. Atkins says, well, science can't explain how nothingness can turn into something, but he hopes that eventually it will. Now, it needs to be understood, first of all, that Professor Atkins is asking the wrong question. The question is not how nothing can turn itself into something. That is to treat nothingness as though it were something. But nothingness isn't anything. It has no properties, no powers, no potentialities. It can't turn itself into anything. The question, rather, is why did the universe come into being? Why did the universe begin to exist? We're looking for a cause of the universe. And what Professor Atkins says in his book on being is that, in fact, the universe never really began to exist because nothing exists. He says the positive and negative energy in the universe balance each other out, and thus on balance there is zero energy, and therefore really nothing exists. Not you, not me, not Professor Atkins, not the universe. Nothing exists, and therefore there's nothing to explain. Now I want to say, first of all, this is a really bad argument. Just because there's positive and negative energy in the universe doesn't mean that therefore there's nothing. That would be like saying that if I've got 10 pounds in my wallet and I owe you 10 pounds, then in fact I've got nothing in my wallet, which is absurd. Just because on balance I have no financial statement of a positive nature doesn't mean I don't have any money or that money doesn't exist. And thus Christopher Isham, who is a quantum cosmologist at Imperial College, points out there still needs to be ontic seeding, as he puts it, to create the positive and negative energy in the first place. So this is a bad argument for nothing's existing. Secondly, I want to say, in any case, the conclusion is absurd. First of all, it's self-contradictory. If you say there is positive energy and there is negative energy, the is an existential is in those statements. You're saying there exists positive energy and there exists negative energy, and that contradicts the statement that nothing exists. So the position on its face is patently self-contradictory. Moreover, it is absurd to say that nothing exists. I at least exist. And I know that I exist. It's undeniable that you at least exist.
Craig tries to dismiss atheism as just agnosticism, but that misses the point. Admitting we don't know everything isn't weakness, it's honesty. Science works by following evidence, not by filling gaps with God. When Craig argues that evil and God are logically consistent, he ignores the scale of suffering. From the Black Death killing half of Europe to millions of children dying of preventable diseases every year, the claim that a loving God permits this out of some hidden purpose is unfalsifiable and meaningless. It's not evidence, it's an excuse. He also attacks the idea of a universe from nothing, but modern cosmology shows energy can emerge from quantum fluctuations, where positive and negative values balance out. This isn't philosophy, it's physics. The Casimir effect and Hawking radiation demonstrate this at small scales today. Saying God did it adds nothing to our understanding. History shows that every time religion claimed authority, from geocentrism to creationism, science eventually proved it wrong. Atheism isn't about certainty, it's about following the evidence wherever it leads, without assuming a divine conclusion. So here's the real question. Do we accept mystery as God, or do we embrace human curiosity to keep searching for real answers? Comment below with your thoughts. Hit like if this helped clarify the debate, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this one.